Night Show this morning at 6:18 on this Monday edition of the I'm tired today.
Well, you've been laying around all weekend.
I know, right? You would think that, but really I got to woke up this morning because I'm sleeping on the couch for the last couple of days. So
yeah.
I know I'm not in trouble. My wife's been running around with the sniffles. And we're about to go on vacation next week, so everybody's like self-quarantining in the house because nobody wants to get sick before vacation. Right. So, no, it's not COVID. We've already had her tested. She's fine. That's the first thing. Is like it's like if you go, I see you. Everybody's like COVID. Doesn't matter what you do. I got a stomachache. COVID. There you go. We've all kind of just, shocked ourselves in this corner anyway. Yeah. But anyway, it's all good. I did want to touch back on something for a second because we were talking about the Roman Empire, and it just kind of brought up a point and that I think is worth discussing. One of the, when you go back through history and you look at, and again, one of the problems with forgetting our history is that we're doomed to repeat it, right? And this is the problem with whitewashing history to a great degree, and again, as history gets longer and longer, here in the United States, as an example, I spent a lot of time talking to my kids about, World War II, the Civil War, these type of things, because these were defining moments in the U.S. in terms of, changes of direction on attitudes and views and economics and all these things. And so it's important. But the problem is you're getting more and more of this history because we're, obviously the country's getting older now. And so when they're teaching history in school, they have to start, skipping parts of history just to try to get it all, get the major points in, during a semester of school. So we tend to start teaching less and less of our history. And of course, those things that we omit simply because of time, as an example, tend to get forgotten. And, there's very important things to discuss. Here's an example about the Great Depression that most people don't know. We talk about the Great Depression, and that's, generally linked to the stock market crash, right? So we had this run up in 1920 to 29, stock market crashes. But what a lot of people don't remember is, again, because we don't talk about it much, is that there was a massive dust storm in the Midwest of the United States during this period of time. And this was, basically turned a big chunk of the Midwest, Oklahoma and surrounding states into a dust bowl. Cattle were starving. The government had to come in and start buying the cattle to at least get some money to the ranchers at that point. And this was part of the problem that led to job losses. People couldn't get a job, so they all moved out to California. Well, they had, this massive flood of individuals going to California, way more people than you had jobs potentially for picking oranges or anything else out there. And so you wind up with these big, massive tent cities. And so there was more going, and my point about this is there was more going on during the Depression, as an example, than just the stock market crash. And when we forget these things. One of the things I'm writing about now, reviewing this book with on Stephanie Kelton's view of modern monetary theory, is talking about, World War II. And she's like, well, after World War II, we had the golden age, right? Because the government just ran all this debt. No, the government didn't run all this debt. Yes, they ran debts and deficits during World War II, but they were selling war bonds to individuals. That money that they were selling those war bonds to were then used for productive investments. So individuals made an investment into the country. They bought war bonds to fund the war effort. So there was this massive increase in productivity. Yes, the government ran a minor debt and deficit relative to today's levels, but it was large for back then. But these were productive investments. And then coming out of the war, we had this golden age because all these people came back, all Johnny came home from the war again, and he came home. They started buying houses and having families and rebuilding not only just the U.S. economy, but the economies of every other country in the world that had been devastated during the war. So there's all these other factors. It's not just one thing. You can't just say, well, the government ran a debt and we had this massive, innovation phase in the 50s and 60s. No, there was a lot of other factors to this post-World War II that were a function of that. It wasn't the debts and the deficits. It was other factors. But as I was talking about a second ago in the opening monologue, when you go back through history and you look at the evolution of societies, and more importantly, if you look at the evolution of empires, right? So you take a look at the Roman Empire, the Greek Empire, the French, the British, all these countries had these moments. I shouldn't say countries, but these empires had these moments of absolute dominance, and they all ended in the same manner. How did they end? What caused them to end? In every case, it was because of extending themselves too far. They took on too much debt. They wound up debasing their currency. They wound up spreading themselves too thin. And then that led to weaker prosperity, which then led to other issues, which eventually brought down the empire. And we see this repeatedly throughout history, but yet here we are, because we don't study our history and we don't know our history, we wind up doing exactly the same things, right? And these things always start out, similarly, right? We have this idea of victimhood, is that, we start to view ourselves as victims rather than as taking the problems for what they are and then tackling them and doing stuff. So we have this victim attitude. Well, I can't do anything about it. They're doing this to me. Here's a good example of this: student loan debt. That's one of the current symptoms of this victimhood. Oh, it wasn't my fault that I took out all these student loans to go get a degree, and then I didn't graduate, and now I'm saddled with this debt and I can't get a job. That's not my fault. That's the government's fault for inflicting me with all this debt. Right? That's a victim attitude. We have to maintain responsibility. And if you take a look at, earlier generations in our country, particularly when we were going through the massive growth expansion of the country, we were responsible for our issues. And when we took those issues at hand and we dealt with them, there was a good moral fabric to the economy, et cetera. I mean, nuclear families, these type of things. And then that's degraded over time. And when you get to these positions, we then become victims, right? It's not my fault that this has happened. It's somebody else's fault. And regardless of what the reasoning is, whether it's student loan debt or whatever the issue is, these are a result of this victim attitude. It's not my fault I'm in this situation. It's because of something that happened 3 generations ago that I'm in this situation. That's a victim attitude. And then, of course, once you have the victim attitude, you have to demonize somebody because of that victim attitude, right? So it's not my fault. I'm the victim. It was this person or this group or this entity that caused this to happen to me. So we demonize somebody in order to justify and rationalize the fact that we're a victim. Now, none of these are productive. These don't lead to a solving of the problem. This simply exacerbates the problem which currently exists because we're not accepting responsibility for the situation that we're in. The only way that you can solve a problem is to accept and understand the problem that you're in and then begin to deal with the issues. Why am I in this position? What can I do to change it and begin to start making those steps? If you go back and look and, throughout history, at the defining moments where the country or any country or empire came together. But let's just talk about the U.S. for a second. There's plenty of defining moments throughout the U.S. history where, as a country, we came together. And let's go back to World War II for a moment. That was a moment where the entire country came together to a singular cause. Yes, the government was taking on more debt by selling war bonds to individuals, but every individual in the country was buying war bonds to fund the war effort because as a group, as a people, as a country, we were all focused on one primary goal. The women left their homes to go work in factories to produce jeeps and planes and vehicles and tanks and ammunition and everything that was needed for the war effort. There were rations on everything. You couldn't get anything during World War II. You couldn't buy cheese and tires and clothes and these type of things because everything was going towards the war effort. Everything else was rationed here, but that was okay. Everybody was in on a singular focus, a singular mission. We came together as a country. After 9/11, we came together as a country. We had a cause to believe in. Whether you agree with it or not, as a country, we all came together for a common cause. The problem is that as a focus in the country, we have lost our way because we no longer have a cause to believe in. And when we no longer have a cause to believe in, then we become victims. And then we have to find someone else to demonize for it. And and to support that demonization, we then have to create lies in order to support that. But that's the spiral. That's the downward spiral that has led to the demise of every empire throughout history. It's fixable. But in order to fix it, you have to start taking responsibility for your own situation. And that's the one thing that we have decided not to do now. Be right back after the break.
Got questions for Lance later? Ask now at realinvestmentadvice.com.